Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us or staying on, as the case may be. My name is Kasima Tharnpipitchai, and I'm an entrepreneur in residence at SCB 10X. And I'm joined here today by Wayne Chang, who's the CEO of Spruce Systems, who's working on sign-in with Ethereum. So thanks for being here, Wayne. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to talk about decentralized identity.
Yeah, let me know. So let's start with Spruce and tell me what you're working on and what Spruce is working on.
Yeah, so at Spruce, our mission is to let users control their data across the web. We think that instead of users logging into platforms and trying to wrest control over their data there, platforms should have to log into the user's data vaults. And the users can have at their discretion all the control over their data vaults and how their data are used. That's fundamentally what we're trying to do. And we've seen a lot of interest and adoption from the Web3 ecosystem and dApps that want this usage pattern. This has resulted in some early work with the Ethereum Foundation on an initiative called Sign In with Ethereum that allows you to use your existing Ethereum account to sign into services instead of a login provider like Google, Apple, or Facebook.
That's great. And so you're working on signing with Ethereum, which is built on a larger sort of movement or even standard, which is decentralized identity. Can you tell us a little bit of some history about how you get involved in this kind of identity work?
Yeah, so I used to work at a company called Consensus, and there we evaluated a lot of these decentralized networks. They promised to remove intermediaries and make it more efficient, allowing allowing all the network participants to get more surplus instead of having some rent-seeking entity in the middle. So that was a lot of the promise and thought about the network. But it turns out that if you have a decentralized Uber, no one really wants to get into the car if they don't know who the driver is or what their driving history is, or
Sure.
no driver wants a rider that they don't know anything about. So it's actually an important service that you're performing for trust to learn a bit more about who you're doing business with, right? And we see that factoring into the transaction cost, not a gas cost by any means, but in terms of when you do an economic transaction, there's a cost associated, right? So what does that cost? And well, if you don't have a lot of trust, the cost goes up and a whole class of transactions can't happen. So if you're able to add authenticated data to that equation, this person can drive because the DMV said that they're a valid driver. We know they have a good driving history and they're insured. Then maybe you feel that much more confident into, getting into the vehicle, right? And it's not just, a peer-to-peer ride-sharing service that uses this, but if you look at all marketplaces, there's some form of this trust service at the mix. Even in financial markets, with respect to brokerages and self-regulatory organizations, even with regards to buying and selling things, Airbnb, et cetera, there's always this trust element that is enabled by authenticated data. And if we wanted commerce to move decentralized, then we thought that data must also move decentralized so that we can achieve those levels of trust for people. And preferably, it happens privately and allows people to be truly peer-to-peer, not even touching the blockchain for most use cases when you're doing data sharing, but optionally doing so for ZK circuits, et cetera. But I'll stop there.
So at a high level, I mean, we all have digital identities now. What are sort of some of the top line issues and problems that decentralized identity looks to tackle? What's the issue with the way we have identity systems working right now?
Yeah, so what we really want is an identity model where the user and the holder, it's called in the industry, is able to have more discretion over their data. If you're always delegating out to another service to do on your behalf, right? It's a little bit similar to how until cryptocurrencies, it was just the banks that you would have to trust to be able to send and receive assets. But now you can be more sovereign in control of your assets once you have a public-private key pair, right? With a public-private key pair, the same thing can happen to your data, including you actually signing statements and not someone signing statements on your behalf, but you have a key, you're going to sign a statement with it that allows someone to access your data or revoke privileges to your data, et cetera. So this is really the difference, that we have a model that is user-centric and we can put the user in charge because of the advances in public-private key cryptography and adoption, especially in the cryptocurrency and Web3 sectors, because we see that this is one of the most prolific adoption events of public key cryptography with a really captive user base that's excited to try new things and take more ownership for themselves. I don't really know many other places where you can find so many enthusiastic people who are excited about trying new things, who have the kind of mentality where they're taking ownership of key management or trying new solutions that will allow them to manage their keys better. It's kind of a perfect storm in terms of what kind of demographic would work well with self-sovereign identity or this decentralized identity idea. Definitely the Web3 ecosystem, there is strong overlap.
You know, one of the things that really is fascinating for me about decentralized identity is when I first started getting into blockchains and cryptocurrency. I think some friends would ask me, are there applications of these kind of decentralized networks that aren't financial? And I was like, I mean, the financial part is kind of a key piece of this whole thing. Except, you know, decentralized identity comes along. It's like, this is it. This is an amazing application of this kind of decentralized network that has an application that's not financial, which is awesome. One thing that you just mentioned, which I want to touch into a little bit, is this idea of self-sovereign identity. And there's a whole self-sovereign identity movement. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the self-sovereign identity movement has, I think, started over 10 years ago. I think there were many important conferences and venues, including Rebooting the Web of Trust, which is happening at The Hague in the Netherlands, I think later this fall. There's a conference called the Internet Identity Workshop, where a lot of folks show up and figure out what are good standards for the identity ecosystem. And I think a lot of the work, there was one really important blog post by Christopher Allen, who is one of the co-authors of TLS, talking about the laws of self-sovereign identity, very related to the laws of identity that Kim Cameron, who has passed away, but basically his work and legacy, you know, is the laws of identity, which I highly recommend we check out. In terms of, as we move to the digital era and we have to get all our credentials and facts about ourselves in digital form, whether it's our passports, driver licenses, financial histories, bank statements, a lot of these are slowly becoming digital. How can we do that while also maintaining the same degree of ownership and autonomy that individuals can expect with paper or stuff they're used to today, right? You don't have to ask a tech giant if you can use your passport. It's probably in your home that you have property rights to, or at least renters agreements for, and you can grab your passport and decide to show it in many parts of the world, right? So how do we just do that, but digital, right? And if we always have intermediaries that say, whoa, you know, oh, technology is so difficult, you know what, let us just take care of everything for you. And we just compromise the sovereignty for convenience. You know, I think this creates a lot of principal agent problems where you have, you know, we just saw the EU take action against some large internet companies for that very reason, because they were getting too overreaching in a lot of markets.
Yeah, I think something like that's a really interesting point, because I think there was some foundational moment for me around just like, you know, my life on the internet. Maybe like, I want to say 15 years ago, when I realized that access to my own email was sort of key to everything. Like that's the central thing to everything. And it's still unnerving. Of course, I still use, you know, one of these large central email providers, because managing that is very, very difficult. You know, managing your own sort of email server and stuff like that. But I realized that there's so much of my life that's stored and controlled by this other entity. You know, and one thing that's sort of fascinating about the decentralized identity, both the movement and the standard, is there's this other level of verifiable credentials that allows you to hold a lot of this information yourself. And there was as we were sort of looking into decentralized identity and looking at Spruce, there was a moment for me that I was like, oh, we've just recreated the same sort of characteristics as a piece of paper would have, like a paper certificate or some kind of unique token, you know, very much like a passport, and that you retain control over that, which is awesome that we've sort of gotten all the way around here. And there's so many issues that we've created for ourselves by having these centralized identity systems that it took us some time to get us to a standard that allows us to sort of recreate some of the sort of interaction models that we've become accustomed to, and actually feel so much more normal when you think about it in terms of things like a physical passport or a physical ID or a physical certificate, you know?
Yeah, totally agreed. And just to kind of touch on the point you mentioned earlier, so if you do use an email provider, which is most of us, I use several, and there are great reasons to use a centralized login provider. Their security is great. I think Google, Apple, they have some of the best security teams in the world, great cryptographers working there. So huge amount of effort goes into securing those systems and locking it down. But at the same time, there is that power balance where, if one day one of these services decides to revoke your email, well, it's not just the services they give that you lose control to, but it's anything you ever use that email for. It's kind of gone, right? Because the reset password's not going to work. You're not going to be able to get the email to reset the password. That's a lot of people's root of trust, right? So just like how a lot of people saw, oh, big banks have that, but it does work decently for a large swath of the population. But for people who really care about taking more control digitally, we think that it should absolutely be allowed. And that's one of the things that decentralized identifiers let us do. One of the purposes for the specification decentralized identifiers at W3C, which was recently ratified as a global standard. So we're really happy to see that. One of the motivators was, can we create identifiers like an email that are inherently user controlled? Or can we define a scheme that can allow for user controlled identifiers, right? And a lot of our work has been bridging the work with decentralized identifiers and blockchain accounts. If there are tens of millions of monthly active users across blockchains, then they also want to use their accounts for other things like logging in or sending messages or signing off files or making statements. Then that's exactly the kind of thing we want to support, and that's what Spruce is focused on. So to your point about verifiable credentials, that's kind of a data layer that goes on top of decentralized identifiers. Verifiable credentials don't need to be used with decentralized identifiers. That's a nice thing about interoperability. If you just have regular HTTPS websites, then it works fine as well. We know of several deployments by NIH in the UK that use this approach, so that's fine too. But the point is, it can interoperate whether the system is old or new, and I think that's really one of the key benefits of decentralized identifiers. You're able to bridge disparate trust systems so they can talk to each other if they agree on the same basis for conversation. And I think one of the follow-ons is verifiable credentials on top of that, which are basically digitally signed statements about reality. So whatever you want to say, you can represent it as a verifiable credential. There's a whole art and magic show to, get an ecosystem that is able to speak the same language. For example, if you have a diploma in France and a diploma in the US, how do you match them up? Because sometimes people have different names or even different categories for coursework, right? So we even have this problem with DAOs and Web3. There's an initiative looking at how we use verifiable credentials to represent claims around DAOs. So, but definitely that's a really exciting area for us.
Yeah, and you mentioned the decentralized identifier standard coming out of the W3C, and you have been involved in that process for a long time. Is there some history or some color you can give us to getting that into a standard and working that through that process?
Yeah, well, I've been involved with W3C, and Spruce has been a member for a few years. Still a drop in the bucket compared to some of the real old timers who have been around since, like the 80s or 90s, who've just been out specifications. So I just wanted to, pay respect to them. But in terms of figuring out, the standards process, it's like a lot of people have different interests and they all show up to a room, and but they have a common goal, and hopefully the common goal they're aligned with helps them be functional enough to work together, make the different trade-offs. There were so many different entities as part of the working group. We saw Microsoft there. We saw GS1 there, which invented the barcode and defines a lot of the shipping industry standards for data transmission. And we've seen blockchain startups there. We've seen Web3 companies like Spruce there. And everyone wants something out of this format for representing a user identifier, whether using it to track a vessel in the sea somewhere, or whether it's a Web3 user who wants to link their Ethereum and Solana account. There are different ways to bridge these different systems. And the really exciting part is eventually they can all talk to each other. You just have to define the interoperability. And that's going to be a hard battle to get there. But having, again, a set of standards to start from really helps bring the conversation together. Same thing with verifiable credentials. I think some of the companies I mentioned they're active in one of those two groups. I can't say which exactly, but you can look on the W3C website and it's all listed there.
Cool. So now that there's a standard that's been ratified by the W3C, when you look at sort of decentralized identity in general, or even this particular standard decentralized identifiers, or signing with Ethereum that Spruce is working on, what are sort of the next market drivers that are going to make this thing, that are going to get us to adoption?
Yeah, so I think that this really depends on which ecosystem. We see it bubbling up on a bunch of fronts. It's not just necessarily like one concerted effort. And this is kind of what we like to see, because it means that a lot of group technologists have independently found the standards valuable enough to implement and trial in their categories. So we've seen things as far as like financial services, to supply chain, to purely Web3 use cases with DAOs, to government use cases. So where the government is the issuer of credentials to businesses, for example, in British Columbia and Canada. So those are some examples. Basically, I think adoption in Web3 is what we're focused on. And we talk to a lot of application developers who wish that they had more information about their users, and their users actually wanted to share that information. They hold a certain NFT, or they did many trades on an exchange, or any aspect of their on-chain history, but combined with possibly off-chain data. The fact that maybe they're coming from a centralized exchange and they have a great trading history there. How do they use that to get, preferable treatment with the protocol if they're going to do a lot of transaction volume, right? How do they use the fact that they've been through some kind of compliance process so they can trade regulated assets on a DeFi exchange? And DAO members, how do you take your reputation with you from DAO to DAO without doxing yourself as the same person? Maybe you have different personas for different DAOs, and that should be totally okay. You should be able to selectively choose what you share with the new DAO members and establish yourself without strongly correlating you with all your other identifiers. So we think a combination of using blockchain data and verifiable credentials is probably the right approach. We hear a lot of discussion about the soul-bound tokens and also verifiable credentials, and a lot of it is versus kind of discussion, but we hold the view that it's an and kind of thing. You can use them both, and probably appropriate use cases for each.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about your views on soul-bound tokens? How does that affect the identity ecosystem?
Yeah, so we'll clarify the origin of soulbound token. To my understanding, it was from the game World of Warcraft, and they had items that were soul bound to your character, so a video game character, right? We weren't trying to, the nomenclature is not to imply that it's bound to the soul of a human being. Another term that we prefer is non-transferable tokens, so tokens that kind of stay with an Ethereum address or a blockchain account, right? And basically, a lot of people think that we're going to be able to collect attributes around an Ethereum address or blockchain account. And when that address does things, whether it's on-chain or off-chain, such as by using sign in with Ethereum, then you're able to learn more about who you're talking to, kind of like in the Uber example or the P2P ride sharing example I gave earlier. And you're allowed to do things, right, based on that. And if you squint, that kind of sounds like zero trust architecture, which is a really popular trend in the security industry, where you show up with nothing but an identifier and you slowly add the information until you reach the right kind of access level you want. And that's kind of a soulbound token. And I think that one of the things we'd like to see is a specification about exactly what a soulbound token is, because they're kind of different directions. But at the same time, the implication when people say soulbound token is that it's public data that's forever and always tied to a certain blockchain account, right? And that could be pretty horrible if you're, moving into data regulation and thinking about that, or there could be a privacy nightmare if you start putting stuff you shouldn't against an account, right? Or there might be sort of inadvertent effects where you have multiple accounts and they somehow get correlated because of your public data, right? But sort of the strong version of the other argument is that, well, because it's so unspecified, it could be as ranging as far as like, we're going to store the soulbound token on a ZK rollup that only a few select people have the actual original data set for, and only the circuit will be on the chain, right? And if you squint, it starts to look a lot like a verifiable credential. And, so we think that it's the same concept. It's just, where are you disclosing the data? Because a verifiable credential is a signed data packet that can be held offline, never has to touch blockchain. Most of them never should, right? So I think it's not either or. I think it's like, when do you use which one? And systems will probably support both.
Is this something that Spruce is looking into supporting?
Yeah, we already support verifiable credentials. We also support collaborations with the Graph and other indexer services that allow you to find data that people would consider these non-transferable tokens. So by that combination, we support all sorts of use cases for that. I think one of the thought experiments we have is, well, the verifiable credentials data model allows for us to define a proof, not necessarily a cryptographic signature. So maybe the proof is that you go to the blockchain and you figure out if the Ethereum mainnet smart contract has a certain data value, right? And then you check that against the data in your local packets, and that's the verification method, right? So that potentially would just bridge slowdown tokens as represented as verifiable credentials. And that would just, so SBTs would be verifiable credential. It's just kind of one that is publicly broadcasted in some cases.
Right. Okay. Interesting. That's an interesting, the squinting, it really helps sort of see things kind of from a high level. We've mentioned Ethereum a lot on this call, and partly, I'm generally focused on crypto. Obviously, Spruce is working on signing with Ethereum, and so you're part of that whole ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit more about your signing with Ethereum work?
Yeah. So I think it was sometime last year, like the second half of the year, the Ethereum Foundation and ENS put out a request for a proposal, and sign-in with Ethereum has been something the Ethereum ecosystem has been doing for a long time already. So that's one of the reasons why it started in that ecosystem. And I think after Vitalik gave a talk on, I think, identity at ETC, basically, a lot of people were excited about the potential of standardizing how people sign in with Ethereum. When we standardize how someone signs in with Ethereum, we can get a whole bunch of security and usability benefits. So one of the security benefits we get with the standard message format, when you sign the message, you're signed in, we can have default fields that make it more secure, like adding a nonce that changes every time the user wants to log in, or expiration for the session, or even if the message format is predictable, one of the most important things we get is domain binding, where a wallet can check if the login is valid for the domain. So when example.org wants you to sign into example.org, right, the wallet can actually go check that you're talking to example.org over a secure connection. And if you're not, then it can throw a page that looks like a TLS error. If you ever seen the red lock icon in your browser, right, that's the kind of feeling, wait a minute, something fishy might be going on here, letting the user have another chance to reconsider. And also, when we have a standard for that, you're able to interpret the message as a wallet and present a really beautiful login experience to the user. And it feels like a passwordless login because it is. And the user can then just proceed. And it's actually faster than remembering passwords or trying to wrangle with the password manager. You have your wallet already. So for the demographic of users that already have blockchain accounts and are actively using them, this is actually the best login solution for many of them. And there are like challenges and things that we have to continue to evolve to improve privacy characteristics. But we think that in terms of UX, this is actually a really good direction.
Yeah, I mean, we all have I love this feature of this cryptographic feature. I think it's like going to be foundational to maintaining both our security and our privacy going forward. I think a question that a lot of us have working in the space and looking at things like decentralized identity is, when you talk about signing with Ethereum, do you think it's possible for that to sort of become something like that, to become the main identity system in sort of like the world of Web 2 even?
Yeah, I think so. I think that some form of this will be the case. So one of the bridges that we built from this is a DID method called DID-PKH. DID-PKH stands for public key hash. And it's basically the idea that if you have a blockchain account, you already have a decentralized identifier that can talk to all the other decentralized identifier systems that support the same protocols. So how we do that is you just simply paste the network, so Ethereum, and whatever represents Ethereum, mainnet would be 1, and then you would just paste the Ethereum address right after. But that's applicable to other blockchains too, including Solana or Cosmos or anything else. They can all be unified under a single DID method, and that can further integrate to other DID methods. So if you have one based on Microsoft's Ion solution, can talk to each other. You just have to define the protocol for interoperability. And I think that this kind of pattern can just stretch across all the use cases.
Mhm.
I think that will they all be Bitcoin curve-based Ethereum addresses? Maybe for some sectors, but there might be better curves or better functionality that DIDs give for others. Sometimes you want key rotation and DID PKH doesn't give you that. So maybe you can take your Ethereum address based DID and start upgrading it. There's a DID method called DID ENS, where you use your ENS name as the decentralized identifier suffix. And from there, you can rotate your keys by sending the NFT around to different Ethereum accounts, right? So now you have key rotation with that one. But an alternative way to rotate your keys would be to register your Ethereum address with Microsoft's DID Ion if you want a federated enterprise network to rotate your keys for you and rely on the data availability of that instead of L1 Ethereum, right? So these things will be very interoperable. I think this pattern is highly scalable.
Cool, very cool. Wayne, we're running a little bit out of time, and I want to close it with a little bit of a question that's fun for me. But you know, as we talk about you mentioned Microsoft Ion, and we spent some time talking about W3C, and I know there's also another foundation that's working on additional standards called the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which is something that Spruce is also a part of. And as part of that, I think TBD, which comes out of Block, which used to be Square, recently announced this idea of Web 5. And Web 5 is generally built on decentralized. I mean, the foundation of it is decentralized identity, and then sort of like growing it from there. Tell us your thoughts about Web 5? What was your reaction to it? Had you seen some of that stuff before? And is Spruce working on that stuff?
Yeah, so I think that so we have collaborated a bunch with folks who worked at Block. They worked at other places before that and have always just been longtime decentralized identity fans. Whatever it's called, we like the principles of user-centric data models where the holder can have things, right? And they seems to be shared across a lot of Block's announcements. I think that what the place to really look is the decentralized web node specification at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and probably figure out a link after this presentation or this chat, but that's where a lot of the developments are. I really like when people develop in the open like that. And what we really need across all these companies building these data vaults for people is some really foundational standards for how do we have a data vault that the user controls to begin with. How do different people access that for read and write privileges? How do we do discovery to see if a user has a certain set of credentials that you want? These are all important problems to solve. So they're really playing in the same space. So I think that the short answer is join some of the groups of the Decentralized Identity Foundation and find out this ecosystem is just starting to get kicked off. And I think it'll be very exciting through the winter here.
That's awesome. This stuff. The reason I was willing to wake up at 4 is I really want to talk to you about this stuff because I'm very excited about the possibilities of decentralized identifiers. And Wayne, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank you for joining us. And if there's anything, how can they find you, and how can they find out more about Spruce?
Yeah, so Twitter is the best place. So my handle is at wycdd, and Spruce is at SpruceID on Twitter, and all our Discord, chats, etc., all listed there. So thanks so much for having me on. It was awesome talking to you about decentralized identity.
Thank you, Wayne. And if you want to find us, you can look for SCB10X on Twitter, and also I think we're very active on LinkedIn as well. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.